Okay, so I'm going to see how this morning goes. I'm thinking it's going to be shorter. Well, we'll see. Okay, I'm hoping. Well, I'm pretty sure. I know, I shouldn't. So this morning, we've been in Luke, right? And we've been going through like the birth of Jesus in the book of Luke. Now we're swapping back to Matthew for the last like story we have surrounding the birth of Jesus. And my plan had been basically to do that whole chapter 2, because that's the story of the Wisemen. But then when I started like doing some reading and research and stuff, I got distracted and was kind of tossing up halfway through the week whether we were going to have any lesson at all. But in the end, we're going to go through some stuff, because I found some stuff that I think is really interesting and really helpful for understanding the story. But what it means is we're only going to get through like the first few verses in chapter 2. But it also means it should be shorter and we should finish earlier, and then we can do like a couple questions or something like that. Finally. Okay, so this is how we were in Matthew. This is how Matthew ended before we swapped to Luke and looked at the birth of Jesus in Luke, and now we're coming back to Matthew. So it ended like this. When Joseph awoke from sleep, this is like the angels come and told Joseph, Mary's pregnant, but she hasn't been unfaithful to you. This is a child of God, marry her. And it says, when he woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord told him. He took Mary as his wife, but he did not have marital relations with her until she had given birth to a son, whom he named Jesus. Chapter 1. Chapter 2 carries on like this.
After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, in the time of King Herod, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is the one who is born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was alarmed, and all of Jerusalem with him.
Familiar verses? Yeah, it's like Christmas every year pretty much, yeah. Now, as I said, we went from Matthew chapter 1, the end of Matthew chapter 1, Jesus is born, and then it says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, this happened. And thankfully, from Luke, we know like actually quite a lot happened between verse 25 of Matthew 1 and verse 1 of Matthew 2. We know that for a start, Jesus and Mary and Joseph weren't from Bethlehem. They were actually from Nazareth. You wouldn't know that reading Matthew. You'd just assume Jesus was born in Bethlehem because that's where Mary and Joseph were from. We know that they had to travel there from Nazareth. We know why they had to travel there. We know that that Jesus, after he was born, was put in an animal manger because there was no room for them. That's Luke. We know that the shepherds came to worship him after being told by this like army of angels in heaven, and then went around and told everybody this little child is the Messiah, right? We know that after 40 days, what happened? That was last week.
Oh, they went to the temple.
They went to temple, offered the sacrifice that you're supposed to offer for your firstborn child, and then were met by two old people, Simeon and...
I think she was unknown.
She was named.
Was she?
Yeah, she actually was given very precise naming. Strangely precise for somebody so old who would not have been alive anymore by the time Luke was writing.
What verse is it?
Chapter 2.
Luke.
It's all right. It's named Anna. Anna, daughter of Penuel, from the tribe of Asher, I think. Yeah. So Simeon, Anna, they both come up. They recognize Jesus. This is the Messiah, this little baby. They start worshiping God. They start telling everybody around this baby is the Messiah. So all that has happened between the end of Matthew 1 and the start of Matthew 2. Which again is like, without the Gospel of Luke, you wouldn't know any of that. But if you only had the Gospel of Luke, you wouldn't know anything about what we're going to be reading about today and next week. Well, next time. Because that's only in Matthew. And so this is the advantage, how great it is to have like multiple records of Jesus' life. You know? Get this much fuller picture. I just wish there were like 10 of them instead of 4. But presumably 4 tell us everything we need to know. Okay, so again, Matthew tells us that this event that he's about to tell us about happened after Jesus was born, and that it happened in the time of King Herod. Now, we already looked a little bit at Herod back when we, actually now weeks and weeks and weeks ago, when we looked at the birth of John the Baptist. Because Luke told us that John the Baptist was conceived in the time of when Herod was king of Judea. So we spent a bit of time looking at Herod, who he was, and what his story was back then, but I think it's actually worth looking at it a little bit more this morning, because there's actually a lot going on in here, historically, that's interesting, but it also affects the way that you understand these verses. And I enjoyed it, learning about it, and so I thought we'd do a little bit of a history lesson today that puts the rest of the story into some quite cool context. So, yeah, okay. It was in the time of King Herod that the wise men came from the east. To know what's going on, we're going to go back quite a long way to about 1000 BC, 1,000 years before Jesus, which is when God established not the nation of Israel, but the kingdom of Israel, where he gave them a king. The first king being Saul, not the best, followed then by David, who probably was the best. He was definitely the king that God wanted for them, the man who had a heart like God's heart. What was his occupation before he became a king? Shepherd, yeah. Okay, so you have God establishing the kingdom of Israel, and you have King Saul, David, and then David's son Solomon, which is probably when the kingdom was at its greatest, both in power and wealth and size. But after Solomon dies, does anybody know what happened to Israel?
It's not the Judges, is it? That's earlier.
Judges is before the kings.
Does the temple get destroyed? Oh yeah,
Much later. Sorry? They get split in two. Do you remember why? Solomon made the kingdom magnificent. He built he built the temple for God in Jerusalem. He built himself an even bigger palace, all these things. But this cost a lot of money. So he was taxing the people very heavily. And when Solomon's son took over, his advisors were I can't remember now which were the young ones and which were the old ones, but one set of advisors said you should basically make things easier for people, and then they'll respect you and they'll want to follow you. But his other advisors came in and said, no, you should they need to respect you. You need to be even harder on them than Solomon was. And when he does that, basically the people in the north are forget it. We got no interest following you. And so the kingdom split in two. And in the south, you had the descendants of David, Solomon's son and his son and his son, who continued to be kings over the southern kingdom of Judah. But in the north, they split off and they started their own kingdom and with their own kings. And they basically just were random guys that were appointed through history. But up in the north, they had a problem because the temple where they're supposed to worship God is in Jerusalem, which is in their enemy kingdom of Judah, right? So they don't want their people going into Judah to worship God there, because who knows what's going to happen. And so they had to try to figure some other way to worship God that didn't involve doing what God had told them to do and go to Jerusalem. And so that basically caused all sorts of problems. They started setting up temples and altars and things all over, and invariably ended up worshiping idols. And so the kings in the north pretty much were all bad. They all encouraged the people to worship idols. And so eventually, in about 700 BC, God allowed this empire in the north, the Assyrian Empire, to come and wipe out the northern kingdom of Israel. So now the kingdom of Israel no longer exists. All that's left is the kingdom of Judah in the south. Judah did a little bit better, at least some of their kings were reasonably good, encouraged their people to worship God properly, got rid of all the idol altars and that kind of stuff, but they still weren't great. And in the end, God allowed, so the Assyrian Empire is replaced by the Babylonian Empire, and eventually in about 600 BC, through Nebuchadnezzar, God allows the Babylonians to conquer the southern kingdom of Judah. And now the nation of Israel is done. And Nebuchadnezzar took all the Israelites from Judah, or the Jews from Judah, back to Babylon as prisoners, as exiles. And that included a young Jewish man called? Daniel, yeah. Daniel was a young prince in Jerusalem that was taken prisoner by Nebuchadnezzar back to Babylon. And what did he do there? Do you remember? Yeah. What position did he have in Babylon?
Senior advisor.
Yeah, he was in chapter 1. He's like a young guy, probably still a teenager, that's been taken as a prisoner to Babylon, and he gets trained up as a Babylonian a wise man in like the wisdom and stuff of the Babylonians to advise the king. And anyway, it's a whole interesting story of Daniel. Anyway, so that lasts not very long. About 66 years later, I think, a new empire rises. The Persian Empire, led by, if you remember, I don't know how many of you remember when we were in Esther, we looked at this. There was this guy called Cyrus the Great, who was the leader of the Persian Empire. And it's amazing, like there's a prophecy in Isaiah where God prophesies about Cyrus conquering Babylon, how he does it pretty much, and then says, you're going to let my people go back to Jerusalem to rebuild my temple. And he calls him by name. This is in 700 BC, so it's like hundreds of years before, 200-300 years earlier, God says, I've called you by name, Cyrus. It's very cool. But anyway, so that's what happens. The Persian Empire conquers the Babylonian Empire, and now the Jews living in Babylon are no longer under the Babylonian Empire, they're now under the Persian Empire. And Cyrus sets them free and encourages them to go back to Jerusalem and actually pays for them to rebuild the temple of God in Jerusalem. It's pretty cool. So anyway, the Persian Empire was huge, and it lasted about 200 years until, not quite, until this rather remarkable young man called Alexander the Great unites what were basically just a bunch of little city-states in Greece. He unites them under one banner, the Greek nation, and he becomes their king when he's about 20 years old. At the age of 22, he sets out to conquer the Persians. Amazing, right? And within 3 years, he'd wiped them out. He was like unbelievable. He was a strategic genius. He never lost a single battle that he fought.
But didn't he die to like malaria?
Yep. By the age of 32, 10 years later, he died in Babylon, probably of malaria, having conquered the known world and having never lost a battle that he fought. Amazing, amazing. But Alexander had no heirs. He had no legitimate children anyway. And so when he died, there was nobody obvious to take over his empire that had only really been around for 10 years. And so it was split up, it was broken up into his different, 4 of his generals. Seleucus took over the eastern leg, Ptolemy took over the south, basically Egypt, and then you had Cassander and Antigonus up in the north who took over the European parts. And then those empires, or kingdoms, I guess, fought with each other for power for the years that followed. And initially, Israel was under Ptolemy's rule, but later the Seleucids conquered that part of. So basically, these guys are all fighting with each other, and who's stuck in the middle? Israel. Always Israel. It's a super strategically important part of the world that everybody from Africa, Asia, and Europe, it all meets in Israel. And so they're always fighting over this bit of land. And so anyway, the Seleucids took over the Jerusalem and the kingdom of Judah. But the Jews living in Judah weren't really happy with that. Actually, there's a whole long story about what happened. This Antiochus Epiphanes, this guy who slaughtered a pig on the altar in Jerusalem in the temple of God and set up an idol to Zeus in God's temple. And he's a picture of the Antichrist. It's like a, what do you call it? Like a pattern. Gives the picture of what the Antichrist is ultimately going to do in the tribulation. We talked about that when we looked through the end time stuff. Hey, Owen. But anyway, so he made a big mess there, and that caused the Jews to riot and rebel, and they basically managed to fight off the Seleucid Empire and start their own kingdom again, the kingdom of Judea. And it was led by, the rebellion was led by a guy called Judah Maccabee, I think. It's the Maccabeans. And they led this rebellion that fought off the Seleucids. They then established a kingdom, and they were from the family of the Hasmoneans. And so this period of Jewish history is when the Hasmoneans were the kings. And they were basically the descendants of, sort of like the descendants of the Maccabees who led this rebellion. But the Hasmoneans were not from the tribe of Judah. They weren't descendants of David. They were actually Levites, specifically descendants of Aaron. So they were from a priestly family. And so the Hasmoneans that were kings in Judea were both king and high priest. Which is like not how God had set it up, right? It was always the separation. Judah will be kings, and then Levites will be priests. And it's that separation of church and state, so you don't put the powers together, which we still have today. But anyway, so the Hasmoneans set up their little kingdom, and that went well for quite a while, until... Well, yeah, okay. So they set up their kingdom. But in the meantime, the world around them is changing. Up in the north, there's a new empire emerging, Rome. And Rome kind of absorbed the northern parts of the leftovers of Alexander's kingdom, Cassander and Antigonus. Meanwhile, you have the Seleucid Empire and Ptolemy down the south, and they're still fighting with each other. Again, Israel stuck in the middle. Meanwhile, there's a new empire emerging in the east as well, called the Parthians, basically from Iran, like what would now be Iran. And they were gradually eating up more and more of the Seleucid Empire as it was starting to fade. And yeah, I say, again, you've got the kingdom of Judah stuck in the middle down the bottom there. Eventually, yeah. And Ptolemy was relying quite a lot on Roman help to fight off the Seleucids. So all these like alliances and things going on. Anyway, eventually in 63 BC, the Romans came through, wiped out what was left of the Seleucid Empire, and took over the kingdom of Judah in the south, the Hasmonean kingdom. And they took the current king and his son as prisoners back to Rome. And they appointed the uncle, like the brother of the king, as king in Judea, and appointed a guy called Antipater, the Idumean, to be basically, so like the king, technically there's still a kingdom of Judea that's led by a king who is a Hasmonean, but really you're now just a client of Rome. You got to basically do whatever Rome says. And so this king is just there in principle, but he hasn't got actually independence. He can't do what he wants. And he has this guy keeping a very close eye on him, Antipater. Now, his son is a man named Herod. And Herod is governor in the north in the province of Galilee. So anyway, now this is what your area looks like, and you've now got this huge rival empire in the east, the Parthian Empire. About 60 years later, in 57 AD, the son of the rightful king of the Hasmonean kingdom escapes from Rome, comes back to Judea, and he wants to reclaim his throne and reclaim his kingdom. And so he convinces the Parthians to help. And so in 40 AD, the Parthians invade into the Roman Empire. They invade into this area and reinstate this guy, Antigonus, I think he is, Antigonus II, as king in Judea. And they now have this little semi-autonomous state again in about 40 AD. Herod, meanwhile, flees back to Rome after the Parthian invasion, and he gets appointed as king of Judea by the Romans, even though they no longer actually control Judea. It's now controlled by the Hasmoneans on behalf or with the help of the Parthians. And so then, a year later, he comes back to Jerusalem with an army, with the Roman army. And after a couple of years, he lays siege to Jerusalem, and he ends up taking it back. And he then becomes the king of the kingdom of Judea. But again, it's not an independent kingdom anymore. It's part of the Roman Empire. And that's where things stand when the Wisemen arrive. Herod is king. About 30 years after he took back the kingdom for the Romans from the Hasmoneans, who had got it through the power of the Parthians. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. A lot going on, right? Yeah, it's really complicated. Yeah. Okay. Oh, and then, Rome ended up taking over the south as well. We talked about that actually. That was with like Cleopatra, remember? And she was making alliances that was when Caesar Augustus became emperor of Rome after the other people. Anyway, yeah. So, that's the time of King Herod when these wise men came from the east. Now, the first thing is like this Herod, and this is what we talked about when we were in the Gospel of, when we were looking at the story of John the Baptist. He was king of Judea, so he was king of the Jews, if you like, but he was not Jewish. He was the son of Antipater the Idumean. He was Idumean. And that's basically the descendants of Esau, the Edomites. So like Jacob's brother, that's where he comes from. And they lived across the sea of, across the Jordan on this side over here. And they had been a part of the Hasmonean kingdom, like they'd been conquered, but he was not Jewish. And so that kind of made him a little bit paranoid. He was obsessed with power. He obviously very much wanted to be king. And he was terrified of anybody who might threaten that power. And so after he took the throne back from the Hasmoneans and established himself as king of Judea, he had the rest of the Hasmonean family killed. So there was nobody to rival him. And eventually that included his second wife, who was a Hasmonean princess, along with her son. Because they were Hasmoneans, right? And it could be the son that he has could take, combat him for the throne, saying, I'm an actual Hasmonean, I'm the rightful heir, And so he had them killed. He had 3 of his other sons killed because he thought that they might be a threat to his throne. And in fact, there's a joke recorded from, it's written quite a lot later, about 400 years later, but there's a Roman historian who quotes this joke that apparently Caesar Augustus, who's the Caesar at this time, used to say about Herod. Whether it's true, we don't know, but he used to say apparently that it's better to be Herod's pig than his son, because he murdered so many of his sons. And technically he was like Jewish religiously, so he wasn't supposed to eat meat, so pork. So if you were a pig, you were better off than being his son. Again, whether he actually said that, don't know, doesn't really matter. That's how Herod was known, right, was incredibly brutal when it came to his keeping control of his power and his throne. He had the Sanhedrin as the Jewish religious council, and when he became king, he had the entire religious council, the entire Sanhedrin killed, except for 2, because all the rest were supportive of the Hasmoneans, and it was just 2 that supported him, and so he had the rest all killed and replaced them with people who would be loyal to him. And yeah, it's pretty rough. With that said, not all bad. He was technically Jewish religiously, even if he wasn't ethnically Jewish, at least nominally so. And so, and because he was Jewish, because the Hasmoneans had conquered the Idumeans when they had their kingdom, and they basically forced everybody to be Jewish if you're in their kingdom. And so his family had grown up in Judaism. And so as king of the Jews, he had a huge renovation and expansion project for the temple. Like, he apparently made it quite incredible, magnificent, awe-inspiring, the temple of God in Jerusalem. He also built like all sorts of palaces and fortresses. Like, have you heard of Masada? There's a hilltop, it's like a mountain, and on top of the mountain there was a fortress there where a group of Jews held off the Roman army for some number of years before, I don't know how long it was actually. They ended up all committing suicide, but it's one of the places you go to see if you go to Israel. It's this like hilltop fortress, and he built that. So anyway, he did a lot for Israel, although he wasn't. Yeah, he's a bit of a psycho. And he continued as king until about 4 BC, when he died from some horrific disease that we'll look at when we get there. But for now, that's the history behind these verses that we're reading in Matthew, that I think help make sense of what's going on here. Because it's in the time of King Herod that these wise men come from the east. Given all the background that we've looked at, where are they coming from? Yeah, the wise men are from the Parthian Empire, which is like an enemy, right? It's Rome's rival power that these wise men are coming from. It's the same empire that invaded Jerusalem and Judea about 30 years earlier. To do what? For what purpose? Do you remember what I said? It was to reinstate the kingdom of Judah and the rightful king, right? The son who'd been taken as prisoner to Rome and fled back, and yeah? Mm-hmm. So Parthia, just 30 years ago, had invaded Judah to reestablish a kingdom there with the rightful king. Can you see why, when King Herod heard that these Parthians had arrived, he was alarmed, and all of Jerusalem were alarmed with him? Added to the fact that it's unlikely that these are just like 3 random guys that show up in Jerusalem from an enemy empire. Much more likely, this was a large delegation, a whole big group of ambassadors, probably with a military escort, because you're going into enemy territory, you know? It was probably this huge procession with, as I say, lots of soldiers, cavalry, whatnot, that are riding into Jerusalem. One wrong move, and you've basically got war between Rome and Parthia. And to make matters even worse, what are they here for?
Jesus.
What do they say?
The one who was born king of the Jews.
Yeah. Where's the one born king of the Jews? You could read that, where's the real king? You know? Not this like fake king, because Herod is not the real king of the Jews. He's been appointed by Rome. He's there on behalf of Rome, and he's not even Jewish. It's interesting, right? Like, makes that whole situation a lot more There's a lot going on there. And as I say, it makes a lot of sense why everybody was so stressed out. Now, to make things even worse and a little bit more complicated, or rather, knowing who the wise men were, what they were, makes it even more complicated, because the word that's translated wise men in Greek is magoi. We say magi. Take out the I. It's the plural of the word magos. Magos. It's the plural of magos. And it was the Greek word for the teachers, priests, physicians, astronomers, astrologers, and magicians that in the Babylonian, Median, and Persian empires. So basically from the east, yeah? In the Eastern empires, which initially were the Babylonians, then it was replaced by the Median and Persians, now it's the Parthians. They had this class of people. It was basically their priestly class that were these things. The intellectuals, the advisors, the priests. And the Greeks called them the magoi, the magi. And we read about this priestly caste all through the ancient Greek manuscripts. There's a guy called Appian who wrote, he was a Greek historian about 150 AD, and he wrote, talking about the time of Alexander, he says, and to those of India, because Alexander's kingdom went all the way to India, he says, in India, Alexander interrogated the Brahmins, who seemed to be the astronomers and learned men of that country, like the Magi among the Persians. Make sense? And then there was another writer, a guy called Strabo, and he wrote about the time of Jesus, this huge encyclopedia that he called Geography. And in it, he said, the Council of the Parthians, according to Posidonius, consisted of two groups. So in the Parthian Empire, there was a council, and that council had two groups in it. You had one, that of the kinsmen, the family members, relatives, and the other, that of the wise men and magi, from both of which groups the kings were appointed. And so what we understand from what Strabo is saying here is that when the Parthians needed a new king, it was the Magi who chose the king from the kinsmen. Those were your two groups involved. You had the kinsmen, the descendants of the king, and then you had the Magi who were the ones who chose them, which one to be the next king. Does that make sense? And so these Magi in the Parthian Empire were incredibly important and powerful. They were literally the kingmakers. They crowned the next king in the Parthian Empire. And so again, can you see why Herod and Jerusalem all freaked out when these Magi showed up? The Parthian kingmakers arrive in Jerusalem and saying, where is the one who is born king of the Jews? Yeah. They basically think they're starting a war, you know? Okay. Now, what brought the Magi to Jerusalem? In the time of King Herod. Yeah, it says that we saw his star when it rose. What that means, I don't really know. I don't think anybody really does. What exactly the star was. There are lots of theories. Some people think it's some natural phenomenon, like some coming together, a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter at a particular time that looked particularly bright that brought them there. Others think it might have been some unusual supernova or weird comet. Other people think that it might be something unique that God created exactly for this purpose, to guide the wise men to Jesus. Some even think that it might be a reappearance of the Shekinah glory, the pillar of fire that sat above the tabernacle when the Israelites were in the wilderness. But ultimately, don't really know. All it says is they saw his star when it rose. Personally, I don't think it can have been anything as dramatic as the Shekinah glory. Because, sorry? No, go on. Okay. Yeah, I find it hard to believe that it was anything like super huge and obvious, because otherwise everybody following it, yeah. So I think it couldn't have been something like that, but at the same time, it must have been something unique that these guys recognized, that people who knew the night sky well, because they were astronomers, right? They studied the stars. And so they obviously recognized that this was unusual.
How do they decipher that something unusual in the sky means Jesus has arrived?
Bang on, because that's a whole other step, right? Everybody who knows the sky well could be like, that's unusual, that's strange. But there's more going on than that. They don't only say, that's weird. They say, hey, look, let's go to Jerusalem and worship the King of the Jews. So there's more going on there. And the question is, how? Why? How did they know that? How did they even know that there was going to be a King of the Jews? That some sign in the sky was going to lead them to. And so, yeah, I think that these Magi didn't only know the night sky and recognize there was something strange. I think they were looking for it. And the question is, why? Well, I didn't put it there actually. That kind of takes us, because also like it says we saw his star. They recognize this as being something unique and something specific to the King of the Jews. We go back all the way to 600 BC. Nebuchadnezzar invades Jerusalem and he takes prisoners back to Babylon, one of which was Daniel. And not long after Daniel gets taken to Babylon, they start training him as a Magi, as a wise man, teaching him astronomy, all these sorts of things. But not long after he gets there, Nebuchadnezzar has a really strange dream that bothers him. And so he asks his wise men to come and his Magi to come and interpret it for him. But he's a new king. He's inherited all of these Magi from his father, and he doesn't really know whether to trust them. Like, do they actually know what they're talking about? And so he sets a test for them, and he's like, I've had this weird dream. I need to know what it means. You guys are supposed to be able to tell me what my dreams mean. But what I want you to do is to tell me what I dreamt, and then tell me what it means. Because if anybody can tell me, make up some story of what my dream means, you know? But if you can tell me what I dreamt, then I'll believe that you know what it means. And the wise men are all like, the Magi are all like, that's crazy. Nobody can do that. And so Herod's like, fine. And he orders, you're all useless to me. He orders them all executed. One of which is this young guy who's just joined training, you know. He suddenly finds out he's on the line to be executed. And so he asks permission to go and see Nebuchadnezzar and speak to him urgently. And when he gets there, the king then asks Daniel, whose name was also Belteshazzar. That was his Babylonian name that they gave him. Are you able to make known to me the dream that I saw, as well as its interpretation? And Daniel replied to the king. I love his reply. He says, the mystery that the king is asking about is such that no wise men, no astrologers, no magicians, or diviners can possibly disclose to the king. Nobody can do that. But there is a God in heaven, and he reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the times to come. And then he goes on to tell him what his dream was and what his dream meant. And then it says that Nebuchadnezzar was like so amazed that he bowed down with his face to the ground and paid homage to Daniel. He gave orders to offer sacrifice and incense to him. I'm not sure how that went down. The king replied to Daniel, certainly your God is a God of gods and Lord of kings and revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. Then the king elevated Daniel to a high position and bestowed on him many marvelous gifts. He granted him authority over the entire province of Babylon and made him the main prefect over all the wise men of Babylon.
Just by doing that one thing.
By doing that one thing, he clearly showed that to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonian Empire, that he had a relationship with somebody pretty powerful, you know. And so he was put in charge of all the Magi in Babylon. Yeah, he was put in charge of them. Who? This young Jewish guy, Daniel. And so I believe that Daniel taught the Magi in Babylon that there was a king coming for the Jews, a Messiah, when to look for him. Because remember, who was it who got the prophecy of the 69 weeks? Daniel. So he knew when this is happening, right? Roughly. And obviously was able to tell them what to look for. Whatever this star was. I got no idea. But they knew, and I think Daniel probably knew, and taught them. And so he taught the Magi in Babylon. The Magi in Babylon became the Magi in Persia. And the Magi in Persia became the Magi in Parthia over the hundreds of years that followed. It's all the same place. And it was those Magi from Parthia who I think had learnt from Daniel, who came to Jerusalem in the time of King Herod to ask, where is the one born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him. Okay. How are we going? Is that? No, that kind of updated. Okay, phew. I was like, there's no way it's 10:30. That'd be yeah, I was like, are we going that fast? Okay. All right, so there's one more thing I want to talk about here. These wise men, they come from the east. They've traveled miles and miles. It probably took months to get from Parthia to Jerusalem. It would have cost them a fortune, and it would have been a very dangerous journey. That's true worship. It requires sacrifice. It costs us something, you know. For these people, it cost them a great deal. But worshiping God is going to require sacrifice. It's going to require giving up things that you value. Like what do you value? That you don't want to lose.
Family.
How would worshiping God cost you your family?
I'm blanking. The followers of Jesus, they uprooted their lives and went to follow with him.
Mm-hmm.
So they had to sacrifice their home and their family life.
Yeah.
To travel along with him.
Yeah. So it can very often cost you people. What else?
Positions, money.
Money. Yeah. It can cost you that. What else? Time. Yeah. I would say those things. Money, time, people, things. Obviously, as directed by God, as God, guided by him. But that's what worship is very often, is it sacrificing things that we care about for God's glory. You know? Coming to church on a Sunday morning, well, you maybe don't get that much choice at your age, but honestly, like there might be times when you'd rather be somewhere else doing something else. Choosing to come to church anyway is worship. That very act is worship, you know? It's sacrifice. Obviously, depending on why you're doing it. If you're coming because you don't want to look bad or you want to look good, it's a different story. But if you're genuinely choosing to give up something that your flesh wants for the purpose of God, to be in his presence, to sing praises to him, that's worship. That's worship. And that worship, the worship, say if you're singing, but even just in being here, the worship is all made all the more real by the fact that it's cost you something, you know? There's a verse in Hebrews that says, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of our lips, acknowledging his name. What do you think that means? What's a sacrifice of praise? Well, it's almost saying that this praise is a sacrifice, is the sacrifice. Again, like a sacrifice costs you something, right? You're losing something. It reminds me of like this song by Matt Redman, Blessed Be Your Name. There's like a line in there that I've always found really powerful that I really love. You guys will know this song. Blessed be your name when the sun's shining down on me, when the world's all as it should be. Blessed be your name. Blessed be your name on the road marked with suffering, though there's pain in the offering. Blessed be your name. It's generally fairly easy to praise God and to bless his name, to say you're great, you're good, thank you.
Good things.
When the sun's shining and everything's easy. But like, what about when it isn't? What about when life is hard, when you're in pain? Can you praise him then? You know, can you say, you're God, you're good. Blessed be your name then. Because that's some deep worship. You know, that to me is what this is talking about, this like sacrifice of praise. It hurts. You're hurting, but you're choosing to trust him and to believe that he's good anyway, you know? Yeah, that's worship. Anyway, these wise men came to worship Jesus, and they sacrificed a lot. I mean, even going into Jerusalem was a dangerous thing for them to be doing, to come and worship him. Now, when they reached Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the Jewish people, what do you think they expected to find? Expectation versus reality. What do you think their expectations were when they showed up there and said, "Where's the one born King of the Jews? We've come to worship him."
Probably weren't expecting Herod to be there.
They were expecting something great and for everyone to know.
For everybody to know, yeah, this is their Messiah, right? This is their king. I think they expected everybody in Jerusalem was like buzzing with excitement that their king had come, you know, and they were just basically wanting somebody to point them in the direction to the palace, where they could go and worship him, where he assumed everybody else was worshiping him, you know. But that's not what happened. That's not what they found at all. Nobody in Jerusalem had any idea what they were talking about, you know. Nor did Herod, the current king. And then to make matters even worse, like they show up and they say, now everybody has been told, apparently, their king has come. Their real king, the one born king. What would you expect their reaction to be? Sorry?
They would expect a point of king.
Blasphemy.
Sorry?
Blasphemy?
The Jews have been waiting for the Messiah for hundreds of years, praying for him. And now these Parthian kingmakers show up and they're like, "Where's your king? He's been born. Where is he?" What would you think? How would you expect the Jewish people to react?
Try and find him.
Yeah? Like excited?
Yeah.
You'd think they'd be excited, right? Yeah, you would think so. But again, that's not what happened. Instead, it says that they were all alarmed. The word that's translated there, alarmed, is tarasso, and it means to stir up, literally. But what do you think that means, like inside a person, metaphorically?
Emotion.
What type of emotion?
Concern. Anxious.
Anger? Can be. But like you've got there's a nice calm lake, and then you go and stir it all up. What's happening? It's all up and down, right? You're in turmoil. Everything's, that's what they're doing. That's what's going on inside of them. It's the same word that's used where Jesus walks out onto water in the middle of the night. The disciples are in a boat in the middle of the lake, and suddenly they see a guy walking towards them. That's how they felt. It's the same thing when they're after Jesus has died and they're all together in a room and suddenly Jesus just appears there. This is how they felt. They're like frightened, like surprised and frightened basically, in turmoil. Shocked and afraid. And that's how the people in Jerusalem felt. They weren't excited by this good news, the gospel of Jesus, their Messiah's here. They were afraid. Why do you think that is? Why would they be afraid when somebody shows up and says, the King is here, the Messiah is here?
Would war start with Rome?
Perhaps, yeah. I think exactly. Like whether or not it's true. Just the fact that this person showing up saying these things is dangerous, right? It could really mess up their lives, make things really complicated. It could bring war. Exactly. Again, Judah is a client state of Rome. They already have an emperor, a king, Caesar Augustus. Showing up here talking about the real king of the Jews, like that could bring the whole Roman army down on Jerusalem. Never mind like the consequences for the current king, Herod, you know? And so basically Jesus could mess up their lives. In reality, that's what Jesus does, is he messes up our lives, you know? And people are still afraid of that. Because if this news, this gospel is true, it's not good for everyone. It's not good news if you want to stay in control of your life. If you want to just keep living your life peacefully, doing what you want to do, and not having any eternal concerns, you know? Because if the gospel is true, it changes everything. It changes all your priorities. Jesus commands us literally to sacrifice everything, to lose your life for him. He literally, he turns your life upside down. Now, there's something unbelievably glorious in that. He gives you something to live for, you know? He gives you a light to follow. We talked about a week or two ago. He gives purpose to everything you do. Everything you do matters eternally, which is glorious if that's something you want, if you want the things you do to matter. But if you'd like to just be able to do whatever you want and it doesn't matter, then Jesus is something to be afraid of, you know? Yeah. Done. That's where we're going to stop today. We have three, We have wise men from the east, from the Parthian Empire, who've come to worship a king in Jerusalem. And the fake king, Herod, and the people of Jerusalem, their hearts are in turmoil. And then we'll see what happens next. Probably in a couple weeks' time, after the holidays. Okay, let's pray. Lord God, thank you for this morning, Lord. I thank you again so much for your word. I thank you that these are not just fairy tales, Lord. It's not just stories, that this is real. It's a part of real history, you know, and it's amazing, Lord. Your word is amazing, and you are amazing. And I pray that you would be with all of us, that you would teach us to worship you from the depths of our heart, Lord, at whatever cost. And that you would make us, I guess, not afraid to lose control of our lives, not afraid of you, not afraid to give over our lives to you, Lord, but excited and honored to worship you with our lives, Lord, and to see what you do with them. I pray for all these guys as they start holidays, and even those who are already on holiday, have gone away. I pray that you'd bless this time, that it'd be restful and fun, but that you would be speaking to them day by day and revealing more and more of yourself and your love to them. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Cool. Quickly, because we're early, sort of. This is quick. This is one of the questions that was in our question box that I was going to answer a while ago when it said that Mary pondered in her heart all of these things. The question was asked, what does it mean when the Bible says to ponder? Specifically in Proverbs 4:26, 5:6, and 5:21. What is God asking us to ponder? So these are those verses. In Proverbs 4, it says, ponder the path of your feet and let all your ways be established. Do not turn to the right or the left. Remove your foot from evil. Proverbs 5 is an interesting proverb. It basically is warning, it's Solomon warning his son not to be seduced by people who want him to do bad things. And specifically, it's given in the picture of like an adulterous woman who will like seduce you to do things you're not supposed to do. And so it's within that context that he says, my son, pay attention to my wisdom. Lend your ear to my understanding. And he had pretty good understanding about this because he had 600 wives. Lest you ponder her path of life. Her ways are unstable. You do not know them. Therefore, hear me now, my children, and do not depart from my words, the words of my mouth. And then at the end of that chapter, it says, for why should you, my son, be enraptured by an immoral woman and be embraced in the arms of a seductress? For the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his paths. So the question is, what does the word pondering mean here? And what is it that God's wanting us to ponder? Do you guys have any ideas? I've got to find my notes.
Ponder just great depth of thought.
Yes. Come on, where have I got them? Yeah, it basically means to think carefully about something. If for interest, the word specifically that's used here in the Hebrew is this word palas, and it means to make something level, which is a bit weird. That's what it literally means. Figuratively, it means to weigh something, because in the old days, that's how a scale worked. So you put the thing you wanted to know how much it weighed on this side, and you put some other things that you knew how much they weighed on this side, and you did it until it was level, and now you knew how much this thing weighed. Okay? So it's make a road level, weigh something figuratively, and then metaphorically, it means to think about, to consider what the consequences of something are going to be, right? What does this thing actually cost? I'm going to do this. What's the consequence going to be? What's the effect going to be? And you can weigh it up, right? Is this thing worth this? You know? Thinking carefully. And so that's what he's asking us to do, is to weigh, to think carefully about these things. About what specifically? That one. Ponder the path of your feet. Do not turn to the right or the left. Remove your foot from evil. What do you think he's saying?
Ponder where you're going and don't do evil.
Yeah.
Ponder what is evil, the consequences of evil.
Again, figuratively, where you're going, right? What are you doing? Think about what you're doing. Think about what the consequences are going to be. If you do, the things you do will be permanent. They'll be established. They will last. They'll matter, eternally even, or not, you know? This one is a bit confusing. The actual Hebrew, exactly what it means is a bit confusing. Whether it's that, lest you ponder her path of life. That's one way that it's translated, is like, basically be careful. Don't start thinking about like the way that she thinks about life, following her path. But other ways that verse is rendered, it can mean like, maybe she doesn't think about what she's doing and what the consequence is going to be. Or she doesn't think about what she should be doing, like the right path. Or you mustn't think about her path. Any or all of those things, I think probably is true. Yeah. But so, and then the last part is like a warning. Don't be seduced to go do things that you shouldn't be doing, because God ponders your path. He thinks about what you're doing, like, and cares about the path that you choose. Yeah. So that's that. If you have more questions, let me know. But yeah.